Like the bang of the world's largest drum, the heavy hit against the massive steel door reverberated throughout the station's streets, echoing back from the surrounding walls despite the sheer amount of bodies that stood in the sound's way, even putting some of the fired gunshots to shame with its sheer intensity. As it washed over the ongoing conflict, it left a very brief moment of silence in its wake, as everyone on both sides needed to assess just what had caused it. For just a breath, only the sound of a soft, buzzing hum remained, as various media outlets' drones circled around and recorded the unfolding situation, which had by now turned into a full-on battle for the streets that had lasted long enough for the news to catch wind, yet somehow still averted the presence of any of the actual forces who would be tasked with containing such an event. While a good number of those struggling in the thick of it flinched, briefly assuming that a new marksman with a yet unseen weapon had entered the fray, the humans standing right in front of the door stood with their eyes wide. Though they couldn't take their attention off the threat of the rioters, their gazes ever so quickly twitched back in the direction of the facility. A sign of life. Of course, the moment of peace didn't last more than a breath, and before they could fully react to this new information, the soldiers already had to face the horde again. Without any reinforcements able to make their way to them yet, the humans were still vastly outnumbered, basically standing on a tiny island in the middle of an ocean of hostiles. Had they been facing a full charge, there was likely nothing they could have done about it, as they'd have been completely overwhelmed within moments. The only thing that kept them able to somewhat defend themselves was that, while they couldn't shoot all of the people that were coming towards them, none of the rioters wanted to become one of the ones that would actually be shot. Only a small number among them had either the guts or the stupidity to actually go on the attack and earn themselves a bullet, while the vast majority remained at a certain distance and simply boxed the humans in with their presence, or seemingly relying on the idea that they wouldn't be shot if they didn't pose any active threat to any of the soldiers. And, in all honesty, the humans themselves struggled with that idea. Putting those down who actively attacked them wouldn't give any of them sleepless nights, but simply unloading into a crowd, hostile or not, was an entirely different story. On the other hand, it wasn't like the people deliberately blocking any path for them to disengage from this conflict didn't pose any threat to them at all. Especially since there was always the chance that guns would soon be brought against them as well, and that risk grew with every moment they were caged here. "Stand back!" a private yelled on the rightmost edge of the defensive formation they had formed, training his weapon on an approaching Cimmeriskis in warning. "Do not come closer!" The larger primate ignored the warning, as he took a few more hobbling jumps in the direction of the soldiers. Running on all fours, he advanced about halfway into the dead zone that had emerged between the soldiers and those trying to box them in, before throwing his arm around in a wide arch to hurl what looked like a broken piece of a large chair in the human's direction. The piece of scrap was, of course, much larger for the humans than it was for the throwing primate, and they had to quickly dash out of the way to not be caught in its trajectory. One of the soldiers standing close by, but not close enough to need to dodge herself, quickly raised her weapon and fired a warning shot in the direction of the offending monkey, who quickly turned on the spot and hurtled back into the protective crowd. The captain in charge of this whole operation felt a pearl of sweat run down his face, and his eyes briefly scanned across the crowd, while also trying to ignore the bleeding bodies of those who had decided this conflict was worth their life, which was now slowly flowing out of them in the empty space between the fronts. This was bad. Even if they weren't as strong as their size suggested, most of these people were far bigger than humans were, and thus able to move considerably larger objects with far greater ease. If they were all going to start throwing things, then... With another echoing bang, the earlier hit against the door repeated itself, and the captain bit down on his lip. Although she was clearly alive, the exact status of the admiral was still unclear. But how are they going to get her out of there if they could barely protect themselves here? "We've got signs of life," he still reported, speaking into his radio without ever taking his eyes off the crowd for even a second. "The admiral is banging against the door. We can't communicate with her under the current circumstances." In any other situation, maybe they could have tried knock signs or very loud yelling or something. But right now, their hands were tied. "Confirm. Captain, someone is right at the door." The voice of the Vice Admiral himself came back through the comm line, causing the captain's eyes to widen. "Confirmed." He quickly gave back before lifting his weapon and, this time without warning, firing at yet another one of the offworlders, who pushed his way out of the larger crowd. The bullet ripped through the Raphaelite's shoulder, forcing the mountain of fur to drop the enormous drawer he had clearly ripped out of some cabinet. A painful hole escaped the giant horned sloth, as his improvised projectile clattered to the ground among a torrent of dark blood. Though the captain hadn't shot to kill, a wound like that could very well be fatal to the rather fragile offworlders. However, he didn't have time to care about that now. "Understood, Captain," the Vice Admiral replied, before seemingly changing channels, since the next message he sent apparently reached all of the soldiers, struggling to hold the line. "All soldiers, this is Vice Admiral Kazedi. At my signal, close your eyes and cover your ears. Be ready." There was a pang in the captain's chest, feeling as if his heart had been kicked by someone, as he was forced to realize just how suspicious that order was. Though he had automatically replied to the Vice Admiral's voice, since that was what he was trained to do, he realized that they had no real confirmation on whether that call was legitimate, meaning that there was a chance they were once again being messed with by some mimicking AI. Which also meant that everyone cover your eyes and ears could very well be a death knell, and depending on the timing, they may not have the chance to "Now!" The order came before he could even finish his thoughts. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. During that seemingly endless moment of clarity, the captain took in the edge of the crowd. The bleeding man he had just shot was in the process of falling backwards, with some of those at his side trying to catch him, while others stared back towards the captain with pure hate in their eyes. They were waiting for a moment of weakness, waiting to get an opening and come down upon them with all their wrath, and yet here he was, forced to make a decision, and make it fast. Protocol would indicate... Oh, well, this was so beyond protocol already. Gut feeling it was. Pressing the air in his lungs through his clenched teeth in a hiss that came from somewhere in the deepest parts of him, he quickly shut his eyes. Dropping his weapon down so it could be caught by its sling, his hand shot up to cover his ears, in addition to the protection they already had. As the world around him turned dark and dull, all he could do was to hope against the knots twisting in his stomach that he didn't make the wrong call. He had no idea how long he was left to ponder in this dark quiet he created for himself. It could have been a fraction of a second. It could just as well have been minutes as far as he knew. His mind had entirely erased the concept of linear time from his awareness, as he was left to do nothing but wait, hope, and dread. But then, eventually, he felt it. Long before any of his other senses could be reached by any stimulus, he felt it in his gut. No, in his entire body. He felt fluid somehow, but not peacefully fluid. Not like a smooth liquid easily flowing along and effortlessly seeping through cracks. No, it was the violent side of fluid. The firm, unrelenting kind that was usually out of sight. Like a closed container filled to the very brim with water and completely sealed from the outside world, right when it received a firm strike against its side. He seemed still, but his insides violently moved in an invisible attempt to compensate for the sudden force acting upon them, with a violence that was hard to compare to anything else. His synapses didn't have any time to fire, but some deeper, more essential part of him still recognized the feeling, even before the flash of light or the thundering roar reached his protected eyes or ears. It took even more time for the heat to wash over him, and incredible heat that thankfully lasted only a moment before it dissipated into the surrounding air. Once it was gone, the captain granted his lungs a small inhale, while his stomach gradually relaxed from the knots it had thrown himself into, witnessing his relief that he had made the right call. As he confidently removed his hands from his ears again, he could hear the pained and confused yells and cries from the crowd, most of whom seemed to not have reacted to the human's sudden, strange demeanor in time. Now they were rubbing their eyes, desperately covering their ears or even glancing around, stunned by the unforeseen onslaught onto their senses. Glancing at his own troops, the captain saw that not all of them had followed the call either. Bert, after training with pepper spray, flashbangs, heavy weaponry, and a whole lot of other things, they would hopefully be able to recover more quickly from the incredibly bright flash and ensuing explosion than the pissed-off civilians could. Grabbing his gun again, he turned his gaze in the other direction. When judging it solely by the intensity of what caused it, the trail of smoke that came from the side of the detention facility was almost suspiciously small and narrow, as it elegantly wound its way up to the station ceiling. But the captain knew that it only came from that first wave of heat, and no more fire was left behind to produce any more. The explosion must have come from a low setting, a very low one, meaning it itself didn't bring any light or heat, only sheer force. Briefly, Admiral Krieger stood shell-shocked as the sudden unexpected shockwave swept through the corridors of the building she had been trapped in. In other circumstances, the thoughts of what exactly may have caused the explosion may have made her cautious. However, in this case, she recognized the gut feeling that had briefly crept through her insides just before it had occurred. That feeling could only be brought by one single source. Therefore, she quickly shook off the stun and began a stiff march in the direction of what would most certainly be a now torn-down wall, drawing both her weapons in preparation for whatever may await her there. As she marched, her radio suddenly crackled to life in a transmission. "Admiral, do you read me?" Celestin's voice came through. He spoke firm, but she could hear the stress behind it. It seemed like the walls had been much more than just a physical barrier. "I read you, Vice Admiral," she replied, not slowing down as she reached for her radio, with the same hand that was holding her pistol. "How's your blood?" She could hear him exhale slowly. "Thick as honey," he replied, which was not as bad of an answer as she expected. It meant that they might be listened to, but he still wanted to speak openly. "Report then," she therefore replied. A bit down the hall, she could already see the incoming light where her exit would be. "We're trying to pull out of the station. Pockets of hostile civilians have popped up all over, and we already have more than a few dozen injured," he explained. "No casualties on our side yet, but some are in critical condition. The station's security is so far unresponsive." Admiral Krieger huffed out a breath as she mulled that information over. Whoever locked her away in here clearly wasn't just a hostile civilian. There was only one thing that could imaginably lock a Veslon out. Meaning that those events were either unrelated, or had the same source but significantly more notable resources allotted to one of the two. "The VIPs?" she asked. "Are startled but safe, at least so far," Celestin replied. "No highly deadly weapons have been brought against them yet." "How long?" she asked in return. "Long enough," Celestin replied, already knowing where her question would be going. So, this wasn't a serious attack, but somebody must have still put it into motion. And whoever did was willing to risk the VIPs dying, but they didn't specifically want them dead, at least not yet. And clearly, she herself had been a specific focus, given her individual confinement, even if it seemed rather random. But why would they... "A distraction," she surmised, before she had even fully finished the thought. "Are there any other news? Anything they wouldn't want our eyes on?" At this point, she had reached the open wall. The entire thing was bent inwards, with the middle of the thick metal peeling open, as if it had been hit by a heavy shelling. Well, in a way, it had been. "If they don't want our eyes on it, they're doing a good job at it," Celestin responded, after a brief moment that was likely used to make sure he didn't forget anything. Krieger exhaled through her nose. It was never good when a distraction was working. Did they want everyone back on the ships? During her thought, she had climbed over the dented metal, careful not to accidentally touch any still superheated parts of its very tips, as she hoisted herself up onto the jagged edges. Standing on the precipice of the outside world, she briefly looked back. Thinking of the prisoners inside gave her pause. However, there was little she could do for them right now. With a single jump, she left her temporary prison, quickly glancing at her surroundings. Almost immediately, her gaze fell upon a tall, dark, imposing figure that approached with clear intent. She didn't know the name of the lanky being with black skin that was dragging the enormous detached tire of some large vehicle behind it, using one of its 3 long tentacle arms. Although it had no discernible head, she could see the menace in the eyes on the top side of its thorax. Scooting 1 foot back into a firm stance, she lifted her pistol in its direction. "Stop right there," she said with a firm voice, and she took aim. The off-worlder did what they were told, at least at first. However, the tense standoff between them and the admiral was interrupted by the sound of whipping air and spraying fluid, hailing from just behind the admiral. She glanced back just in time to see the large body of a Korostilch, who seemed to have appeared out of nowhere, collapse. Their previously raised tail club crashed to the ground as all tension left their muscles, and the pounding impact coincided with the bang of the lethal shot finally reaching her ears, long after it had already hit. Admittedly, the sudden demise of such a large person, who had somehow managed to sneak up on her, gave the Admiral a bit more pause than it should have, which in turn gave the other person facing off with her the necessary confidence to rear back and heavily hold the tire at her. Her gaze instantly snapped to them, fully ready to pull the trigger. However, as soon as they had tossed the item, they already turned tail and ran. Begrudgingly, she tore her attention away from them and instead directed it to the heavy item hurtling towards her at surprising and concerning speed. She knew instinctively that it was already a breath too late to dodge, so she quickly brought her leg up and swung it in an outward arch away from her body. When it made contact with the tire's wall, the robotic limb bent slightly around it, before then springing straight again. The force behind the releasing tension directed the projectile away from her, leaving it to loudly bounce off the ground behind her and soon crash against the wall. "That was a good shot," she thought to herself, as she glanced back at the collapsed tortoise behind her, using the rough trajectory of the killing blow to search for the marksman. With the hostile downed, Sam swept her crosshair along the space surrounding the Admiral, searching for any more active threats. Finding that the area was clear for the moment, she briefly focused back on the Admiral as she began to make her way over towards the encircled soldiers, already speaking something into her radio, though, of course, Sam kept the actual crosshair far away from the Admiral. With her weapons drawn, she approached the wall of rioters, most of whom were still recovering from the shock of suddenly witnessing relativity fire up close. The RR was still perched next to Sam, ready to be quickly put to use again should the need arise, even if it was unlikely that anything else would soon require a weapon of that caliber to be employed again. Yet again it had been broken out to serve as a mere can opener. Oh well, at least it was another successful shot on her record. Now Sam witnessed how the Admiral confidently marched towards the hostile offworlders, her body language very clearly exuding that one of them was going to have to move, and it wouldn't be her. On the other side of the crowd, the soldiers also gathered into a tighter group, with those who were prepared for the blast assisting those who didn't, as they too started to close the gap between them and the crowd, daring those among the hostiles who had stayed back so far to actively try and stop them with their weapons bared. Though their threats would not remain at their weapons alone, because already Sam had the buzzing sounds of drones far bigger than those the news had circling the place in her ear. Within the moment, 3 psychopomps descended upon the crowd. Their rotors kicked up heavy winds as they shone bright spotlights down at the offworlders, with integrated loudspeakers loudly proclaiming to "Stand back from the soldiers!" In one fell swoop, the numbers game between the rioting and the soldiers had become all but irrelevant, as the military drones had no issue taking on whole crowds of people, as long as they didn't have the proper weaponry to take them on. "Captain Anderson, come in!" Vice Admiral Kazadi's voice suddenly came out of her radio, and she quickly reached for it to reply. "Copy, sir," she responded, stroking her slightly dislodged ponytail off her shoulder and back behind her head. "The Admiral's situation is deemed under control," the Vice Admiral then explained. "You are to pack up the relativity rifle, secure it, and then proceed to aid in the evacuation of the closest VIPs. The location will be transmitted to you. Understood?" "Understood, sir," Sam replied, and quickly pushed herself up. She left her large sniper rifle to stand guard for a moment, while she quickly shut the RR down so she could pack it up. In all likelihood, they weren't going to need it anymore. "Your concern is acknowledged and understood, Commander," Fleet Admiral Santo informed Commander Keown, with a firm but sympathetic voice, after the latter had brought the oddity in the enemy's communication to him. We will make sure to stick to any necessary precautionary measures surrounding it. However, right now it is vital that communication to the galaxy's core is restored, as quickly as at all possible. Keown nodded, his long hair swinging along with the movement as he did. I understand, sir, he said. Believe me, nobody wants to ensure that more than I do. I simply didn't want us to be potentially blindsided. Of course, your call was entirely right, the Fleet Admiral replied amicably. You are right. It is strange that this single message broke the pattern, and its probable source makes it even more unusual. The Fleet Admiral looked down at the progress report. The ships were all making sure that they took any securing measure for their internal systems, even if few of those could be reached through communication alone. Any moment now, the fusion satellite will be reactivated. While he watched the footage of the large, ominous structure that was transmitted to him by the ships, he couldn't help but also glance at the floating mass grave, which was all that was left behind of the previously imposing fleet of enemy ships. Orion's arrow was a devastating force, one that had, at least until today, never been used in active combat, mostly for practical reasons. To deploy the arrow, a lot of setup was necessary. It took at least 5 ships that were equipped with the firepower of the very largest of the relativity cannons. They all had to be properly positioned, and they all had to fire their shots on the highest setting, all with a timing and precision that would have the shots and associated hyperspaces connect at the exact same moment, at the exact right angles. If done correctly, space itself, weakened through the unstable hyperspace stretches, would briefly, for what the scientists described as one tick of the universe, collapse in on itself with unrelenting force, crushing anything material within the calculated perimeter into a perfect sphere of conceptual matter. If he was completely honest, even Dr. Santo himself wasn't entirely sure what exactly conceptual matter was supposed to be. He only really knew what it wasn't, and he wasn't entirely sure if that was different for anyone else. Really, the arrow was more of a tactic than a weapon, but the results spoke for themselves. Until now, it had only ever found use in exercises to prove the possibility, and to clear out debris and asteroid fields. It's coming online, he suddenly received, and quickly his gaze snapped back to the satellite, just as the sensor readings he received from the ships gave alarm about an enormous hyperspace being generated. A moment later, the screen automatically dimmed as the blinding display of the emerging stretch began to light up the night sky once again. Not allowing himself to stare at the pillar of light that shot out into deep space, Santo's eyes snapped over to the internal system readings of the ships. There seemed to be nothing concerning, but he would remain vigilant. How are the rescue efforts proceeding? He still inquired, splitting his attention between the possible new threat and the marks that had been left by the old one. The damage the blast caused to the former 9 years has sadly been significant, Commander Keown explained in response. Though he remained professional, the news was clearly weighing on him as he reported. Efforts are still ongoing, but we assume only about 10% of the previously habitable space are still able to support life. Santo sighed. Keep doing what you can for the survivors, he ordered, even though it was hardly one he had to give. Much as it pains me to say it, those who died will have to wait. However, we will make sure their family... He was interrupted, as every single one of the various ship's communication systems simultaneously conveyed an incoming message, sent over all channels, entirely unencrypted. It's happening again, Santo thought, before he loudly ordered, Be careful when opening those! After everyone made sure that any necessary barriers were firm and in place, the messages were allowed into the isolated communication systems, and opened. Santo's face darkened, scrunching up into deep wrinkles as its contents were conveyed to him a moment later. It's a dead end, it read. So cramped. He reached up and grabbed a fistful of his own hair, trying to use some mild tension to help himself focus. A dead end? What was a dead end? And cramped? What was the message talking about, and who had sent it? Of course, the ships quickly tried to track it down, but no luck. It was as if the message had originated right in the satellite, which was either impossible or deeply unsettling if it wasn't. Try to re-establish contact with Avezalon as quickly as possible, he ordered, despite that. Although this uncertainty was most definitely a risk, it wasn't a big enough one to let it deter them. If they wanted to cut us off from the galaxy's core with such methods, there must be a reason for it. Quite concerning, Curie commented, as they carefully used the fine motorical instruments at the end of their foremost backwards legs to slowly remove something from the very tip of the humerus of one of the corpses for which they were assisting in the autopsy. It seems that James's suspicions may have been correct. What they held there was clearly a device of some sort, one that most certainly showed the telltale signs of human-made technology. And, given the loose cable sticking out of one of its ends, once it had been completely free from the bone it had been embedded into, it seemed to be something meant to be integrated into other machinery. The material it was made of was curious, as they took it under closer inspection. Certainly not the usual polymers and metals humans would generally use for this sort of device, even if Curie couldn't quite tell what exactly it was instead just by looking. In the meantime, Tuya was already in the process of summoning the reports they were rather sparingly receiving from the station itself. Quickly, she swiped through them, until she finally found a picture that she could present to the cyborg on the tablet's large screen. This is what they pulled out of the station's walls. Seems like it might just be the same kind of device, she commented, as she held out the photograph of a very similar-seeming device, which however appeared to be made of far more usual materials, when compared to the ones embedded in the would-be assassin's bones. If Curie had to wager a guess, it was very likely that these materials they held here were likely harder to detect for the humans' usual methods, though they would have to figure out why and how before they could make any definitive statements on the matter. I would assume the same, they still concurred, given the clearly very similar construction of both devices. Taking it over to a workbench, they quickly made use of two more of their legs to quickly yet carefully disassemble the device to gain more of an understanding of its function. Thankfully, humanity's technological evolution had led down a path that made it quite easy to match certain parts to certain functions, since designs and methods often repeated themselves in the easy-to-make, easy-to-replace philosophy it followed. This device was meant to allow for direct connections, they quickly concluded, once they had the individual parts laid out. It is a receiver. Had it been inserted into the ship's systems, there is a very real chance that it could have jeopardized the isolation of disconnected systems. Which may have allowed Michael a way in, Tuya mumbled, briefly chewing on the knuckle of her right index finger. More likely the people controlling the leftovers of Michael's constructed server, Curie corrected absent-mindedly, which arguably may have been worse. Tuya released a half-amused scoff at that. I wish I had your optimism, she said under her breath, before putting the tablet down to cross her arms. However, it seems like they didn't deem it as an essential to actually get that connection. Curie nodded their body. Possibly a redundancy, Dr. Schramm commented, though he was likely outside of his field of expertise at this point. Still, the idea to smuggle those in that way? He glanced over at the corpse, and at the large incision that was left on its arm after the removal of the device. All that, and they didn't even deem it important, he mumbled, and ran his fingers along his chin, briefly covering his mouth in the process. It may yet have been a good thing that we sent James down there, Tuya agreed, even if she didn't sound at all happy about it. But, if this was the redundancy, and they still set their plan into motion, that means they must have something way bigger that worked somewhere. Concerning, Curie repeated, while gently laying the parts of the device down.